Hey, folks, I've been hearing a lot of talk lately, well, seeing a lot of posts lately, really, about being on the brink of a constitutional crisis. But like the climate crisis, the term sounds urgent, but it is maddeningly vague. I mean, conveniently, no one seems willing to declare that we're in one until it's too late to do anything about it. Hey, folks, I'm Tad Sturmer. I teach public history at Johns Hopkins. I have a PhD in history from the University of Virginia, and I went to law school at Tulane in New Orleans. And I spent a decade in national politics before becoming a historian of America and its founding. Let's think a little bit about the climate crisis. By the time that politicians and corporations and institutions, pretty much anyone not named Greta Thunberg, started sounding the alarm, the actual tipping points had long since passed. The same people who spent decades insisting we're not there yet were the ones still wringing their hands about the urgency of action while the planet was already on fire. We're watching the same thing happen with the Constitution. Liberal nationalists, mostly within or allied to the Democratic Party, keep warning that we're approaching a constitutional crisis. That if certain actions are taken or aren't taken, if certain people aren't stopped by somebody, then we'll be in real trouble. Then we'll be in trouble. But the foundation they're worried about has already collapsed. The United States was never structurally built for true democracy, for the kind of pressures the democracy put on it. Not in 1787, not in 1865, not in 1965, and certainly not now. The system we have today is less about democratic representation than it is about managing the inevitable tensions of minority rule. And for the people who built it, that was the point. And the anti-federalists knew this. The opponents of the Constitution at the time knew this. It was glaringly clear to them. They called it. They warned that the Constitution was too weak to resist the power grabs of the ambitious, too riddled with compromises to guarantee proper representation, and too dependent on institutions that were never designed to be fully accountable. Edmund Randolph warned that the presidency would consolidate too much power and would be easily taken over by a demagogue. He called it a fetus of monarchy, and that fetus could grow. Brutus, one of the anti-federalist writers writing in the New York Journal in 1788, he argued that she, might be they, argued that the judiciary would eventually serve elite interests over those of the people. It could easily. There was no reason why it couldn't. And the Electoral College? It was a DEI project for enslavers. It and the 3/5 clause were designed to preserve, even promote, their political power while allowing allies in the North to pretend it had created a fair system. Good for them. Let's have a chat about 18th century republicanism sometime. What a waste. And yet, we keep pretending that the Constitution's structural weaknesses are shocking new developments instead of baked-in features of the system that have been pointed out for 250 years. It was sitting there in 1788. In any case, the crisis isn't looming. It's here, and it's been here for a while. The Supreme Court has spent the last decade rewriting the Constitution to fit a modern iteration of white aristocracy. Shelby County versus Holder gutted the Voting Rights Act. Dobbs versus Jackson gutted reproductive rights. And D.C. versus Heller overturned 2 centuries of precedent by deciding, conveniently and out of the blue, for gun lobbyists, that the Second Amendment's first clause, it actually didn't really mean anything. And you think those guys aren't ready to deal with birthright citizenship? Where have you been? Meanwhile, Trump and his cronies are and aren't defying federal courts. They're forum hopping. They're ignoring rulings they don't like while waiting for a judge they appointed, and they appointed lots of them, to give them a favorable ruling. And if it reaches the Supreme Court, they've got them too. The same ones who gutted democracy then made the decision in Trump versus the United States that made a joke out of checks and balances, ruling that Trump is entitled to absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for actions within his core constitutional powers and presumptive immunity for all official acts. And his pals are using that exact language to talk about the limits on judicial authority. Where have you been? It was in all of the papers. We knew this was coming. And they have been tearing down all of these rights that were built up in the 20th century for 10 years now. So what exactly are we waiting for when it comes to saying, constitutional crisis? Because if the current political situation isn't enough of a signal, God, what is? That the system the founders built, the same one the anti-federalists warned would be exploited, not could be, would be, is playing out exactly as they feared? And it turns out that January 6th meant nothing. Because we've seen his constitutional crisis in American history, the real thing before, and they ended up meaning something. The Civil War ended with major constitutional change that mostly ended the Republic of the Founders and at least put the United States on a road to democracy. Even Watergate ended in campaign finance and presidential accountability reform. January 6th, no new law, no structural reform, and now with the pardons, no meaningful consequences for either the participants or the architects of insurrection. And it led to justification for its instigator. And now the same people who stood behind these actions the first time are openly acting on the plans they shared with everybody, with the full knowledge of how, maybe, to make that power permanent. Friends, the Constitution is already burning. And if you're waiting for someone in power to tell you we're in crisis, then it's already passed you by. So what do? Well, forget about opposition and lean into resistance. That is not just rhetoric. If history tells us anything about resisting authoritarianism, it's that weak opposition, hand-wringing, procedural delays, and empty declarations of principle, it never stops an encroaching regime. What does? Organized, community-driven, and relentless resistance. And World War II offers some of the clearest lessons on what works, what fails, and what's at stake when people underestimate the threat. One of the most catastrophic failures of World War II resistance was the belief that established institutions, courts, political parties, even foreign governments, would step in before things got too bad. So if you're waiting for a court ruling, a congressional hearing, or some sort of procedural mechanism to stop creeping authoritarianism, or what we have, rushing authoritarianism, you're already behind. History says those mechanisms will bend to power, not the other way around. Resistance has to be direct, local, and independent of the very institutions that are being eroded, even in some cases eliminated. And too many liberal voices in the 1930s insisted that fascism couldn't really take hold, that institutions would eventually self-correct. And that mindset blew everything up. In occupied Europe, many believed resistance was futile until it wasn't. The Italian partisans, the French resistance, the Polish underground, my people, the Norwegian resistance, they were outgunned, outmatched, and often betrayed, and yet they fought. Resistance doesn't work because it guarantees victory. It works because it makes victory possible. Every moment of pushback matters. Seize it, even if it seems small. Meet Keys, who knew a thing or two about the kind of power of that resistance, that which comes from committing to it every day, every morning, in every small action. She said that even an ordinary secretary or a housewife or a teenager can, in their own way, turn on a small light in a dark room. Too many people are still treating the erosion of rights, the rollback of democracy, and the concentration of power as something that might happen instead of something that has already happened. The Constitution isn't about to break, it's broken. The institutions that were supposed to prevent this have failed. It won't be comfortable, it won't be easy, but neither is surrendering to the inevitable. And history has never been kind to those who stood by and waited for someone else to act.